And where we are is on page 2, number 4, looking at Leviticus 23. We've been looking at the structure of Revelation, and I think that's a useful thing for us to do several times so that we begin to get an overview of the book. It's so complicated that it's extremely easy to get lost in the details of Revelation, to get bogged down. Plus, Revelation, since it climaxes everything in the Old Testament, the most useful way to come into the book is to review some of the most important themes of the Old Testament that lead into it. So, we've been looking at the recreation theme, the fact that Revelation seems to be set out in 7 sections. There are repeatedly 7 sections in the book. 7 trumpets, 7 bowls, 7 thunders, 7 angels, chapter 14, 7 seals, 7 churches. Other sections of the book seem to fall readily into sections of 7. And the book itself seems to have 7 sections that fall out according to the structure of Genesis 1, and we've looked at that before. And we'll look at it again today, because it seems as if one of the most important structuring devices in Revelation is to follow the cycle of feasts in the Old Testament from Leviticus 23. And so what we're going to do today is look at Leviticus 23 and then use it as a springboard for surveying Revelation once again in terms of these feasts. So if you'll turn to Leviticus 23, that's where we'll be today. And I hope that by the time we're done with all these surveys and overviews, you've been reminded enough times of the general content and thrust of the book so that when we go into it and get down inside of it and start looking at the details, you don't get just lost. Most of the expositors that I read have the problem of getting lost in the forest and seeing only trees as they go, instead of looking at broad structures and developments in the book. Every book of the Bible has a point. It starts somewhere, it goes somewhere. Exodus starts in Egypt, Pharaoh on the throne. We were building Pharaoh's storage cities. It ends with God on the throne. We have built His house. And it has a motion, certain themes. Revelation is the same. We don't want to get bogged down in the details. So that's why we're doing these overviews. Let's begin with prayer. Father in heaven, bless us now as we consider once again the overall structure and thrust of the book of Revelation. We ask your blessing now, we pray in Christ's name. Amen. Leviticus 23 is the Sabbath section of Leviticus. You can take Leviticus into 5 sections, in which case this is the 4th commandment, the 7th Sabbath section, this chapter here. You can take it other ways as well. All of these books have the same flow. You can divide them different ways, and some of them have multiple outlines. But this whole chapter has to do with Sabbaths and festivals, and that's what we're going to look at here. There are 7 sections here. The first one is the Sabbath itself. Yahweh spoke again to Moses, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, Yahweh's appointed times which you shall proclaim as holy convocations. My appointed times are these. For 6 days work may be done, but on the 7th day there is a Sabbath of complete rest, a holy convocation. You shall not do any work. It's the Sabbath to Yahweh in all your dwellings." Now, one thing I'd like to point out there is it says that every Sabbath is to be a holy convocation. You will hear from evangelical scholars who have been influenced by liberal scholars that the synagogue and weekly Sabbath meetings didn't start up till Ezra. The Bible never says that. It says right here that every Sabbath day was a holy convocation. The synagogue in its first form starts right here with Moses. Every place in every town there was a Levite. Every Sabbath day, as well as every new moon, the people came together for worship. That's not something that starts with Ezra. Ezra may have restructured the synagogue. The Jews say he did. The Bible doesn't say he did, so I don't know. But I know that when Acts 15:21 says Moses from ancient times in every place has those who teach him, it refers back to here. This is the beginning of weekly convocations in Israel. Now, that corresponds to Revelation chapter 1. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. The Lord's day is the new Sabbath day. And we are pictured, Jesus Christ, as having entered into His rest in Revelation 1. And the reason we can tell that is in verse 13. In the middle of the lampstands, one like a son of man, clothed in a robe reaching to his feet, and girded across his breasts with a golden girdle, not girded in his loins. His work is finished. This is a picture of a person who has finished his work and is basically in clothes that you relax in. In other words, you come home from work and you take off your pants that have a belt on them and you put on your robe. See? I mean, sometimes, you get your robe and your slippers out and you sit down in your easy chair and you relax. And that's the picture here. His work is finished. And of course, in Hebrews tells us that he sits down here. He's standing up, but he's girded as if his work is finished. He's entered into Sabbath, and John enters into Sabbath with him. Verse 10, I was in the Spirit on the day of the Lord, on the new Sabbath. So that is the equivalent passage there. That's the first feast here in Leviticus, having to do with light. Now, of course, the Sabbath is usually the seventh, but it's also the first as far as man is concerned, isn't it? Man was made on the sixth day, so the first day of his week is the Sabbath. So this is a human week here. God works 6 days and rests. The seventh man rests the first day and works 6, flowing out of God's rest. You have to enter into God's rest and then move out into work. Then we read the second feast here. These are the appointed times of Yahweh, holy convocations that you will proclaim at the times appointed for them. This is verse 4 of chapter 23. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, at twilight or between the evenings, after the sun goes down but before it's dark, that is Yahweh's Passover. Then on the 15th day of the same month, there's the feast of unleavened bread to Yahweh. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall not do any laborious work. But for 7 days you shall present a food offering to Yahweh. On the 7th day is a holy convocation. You shall not do any laborious work. So what we find here is, the day after Passover is a special Sabbath. 7 days later is a special Sabbath. Sometime during that week there'll probably be a Sabbath day too, which we'll read about in a minute. But there are 2 special ones here. Passover is the time that the Lord came, of course, in Egypt to evaluate the situation there. He evaluated every household in Egypt. The households that had blood on them, he passed by. The households that didn't have blood on them, he killed the firstborn son. That was true whether the household was Hebrew or Egyptian or Ethiopian or Iroquois or whatever groups of mixed multitude strangers happened to be in the country. God passed through and passed judgment on the situation. It was a time of historical judgment, a time of separation. Thus it corresponds to the second day of creation. What happened on the second day? God separated waters above from waters below and created the firmament. Passover creates the human firmament, which is the church, which exists between God and the world. And we've looked at this before, but I'll remind you of it again. Israel is a human firmament between God and the nations. That's why they're positioned in the heavenly places. We have that now. We are the firmament between God and the world. That's created at Passover. It's not created at the Day of Atonement. It's not created on the Sabbath day. It's created at Passover when the lamb substitutes for the firstborn sons and the nation is created. Everybody that participated, whether they were a Hebrew or a mixed multitude person. If they were a Yoruba, if they were whatever they were, if they were a Greek who happened to be in town with his family, whatever peoples were there, Libyans, Ethiopians, Scythians, whatever, and eventually they became the mixed multitude in Israel, God passed by, and they had to have that Passover lamb, and blood on their doorposts. Now, what do we find in Revelation 2 and 3? Not exactly, of course, but an equivalent thing in terms of the structure of this book. These 7 churches Jesus comes to, and he evaluates. He passes by every one of them. He walks among the golden lampstands, right? And as he tours around these lampstands, He checks each one of them out to see how they're burning. Now, how do you check out a lampstand? Well, you check the wick. You see how bright the fire's burning. You may trim the wick. Remember when we studied in Exodus, you have all this equipment that's listed there for dealing with the lamps. You have a little tray and you have tweezers. You pull the wick out, put it on the tray, trim it, put it back in, all this stuff. That's exactly a picture of God trimming the church down. It's the same as trimming a vine or anything else, any other image that the Bible has of God passing through and doing these things. And this is a Passover section here. Okay? He passes by these churches and tells them to shape up or thanks them for doing a good job so far. All of which points forward to Jerusalem or Babylon later on in the book, which is the new Egypt. The city, Babylon, is called Sodom and Egypt, where the Lord was crucified. Chapter 11. The great city, which is spiritually Sodom and Egypt, where the Lord was crucified. That tells you it's Jerusalem. It's Egypt because it receives plagues. It's Sodom because it's like a new Canaan that's going to be conquered by the saints. And it's called Babylon. That's the city that's not going to be passed by because it's not under the blood. Here, these are passed by. Okay, so that's Passover. Then we come, and this is where it starts to become a little bit clearer, the connection with Revelation. If you go back to Leviticus 23 now, verse 9, the third feast or section here. Then Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, When you enter the land which I am going to give you, and reap its harvest, then you shall bring in the sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. And he shall wave the sheaf before Yahweh for you to be accepted. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. Now on the day you wave the sheaf, you shall offer a male lamb 1 year old without defect for an ascension offering to the Lord. Its tribute offering shall then be 2/10 of fine flour mixed with oil, a food offering to Yahweh, a soothing aroma with its libation, 1/4 of a hin of wine. Until this same day, until you have brought in your offering to your God, you shall eat neither bread nor roasted grain nor any new growth. It is to be a perpetual statute throughout your generations in all your dwelling places. Now, this is important for us to have a good feel for. Passover comes on the 14th day of the month. What does the moon look like? Not half full, it's full. Yeah. New moon on the 1st. By the middle of the month is full. Then it goes to new moon. So it's light at night. The festivals that happen in the 14th or 15th day of the month, the moon is always full. Isn't for us because our months are not lunar months, but their months are lunar months. So I don't know why I mentioned that because it doesn't have anything to do with what we're looking at here. But the 14th day is Passover. The next day is a special Sabbath. And then you've got the weekly Sabbath that's chugging along. And sometime during this week, there's going to be a weekly Sabbath that shows up. The day after that Sabbath, which is an 8th day, a Lord's Day, a new day, you have the festival of first fruits. That's what this is. This is equivalent to Jesus' ascension into heaven, which is pictured in Revelation 4 and 5. The first fruits, just a sheaf. Now, verse 15 of Leviticus 23 says, You shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath 7 complete Sabbaths, and you offer a loaf. That's Pentecost. But 49 days before Pentecost, and Pentecost comes on a Sunday too. It is a day after a Sabbath. Pentecost comes on a Sunday, on the first day of the week. The festival of first fruits comes on a Sunday, the first of the week, on the Lord's Day. See? That's where we are in Revelation. That's where we are in Leviticus 23. You bring in the sheaf of first fruits of your harvest to the Lord. Okay, what happens? Notice the association of things here. Go out,
And the way they would do this, they would find the field that was nearest to the tabernacle or temple. Once the Jews kind of decided what's the best way to do this, and they came up with these extra rules that they would follow. Whatever field was nearest to the tabernacle or the temple that had some grain, then the appointed priest would go out there with the people, and he would cut down the first sheaf of grain. Now this grain has grown up and it's blossomed, and now it has ears of wheat on it. And take this. That's all. And he takes it back to the city, or to the tabernacle, and he waves the sheaf before Yahweh to be accepted on the day after the Sabbath. Waving it means holding it up and bringing it back down, giving it to God, and receiving it back, because there's no way to throw it all the way up to heaven. But then he does something that's parallel. On the day when you wave the sheaf, you shall offer a male lamb 1 year old, without defect, for an ascension. And then we're specifically told that with the lamb is a grain offering of 2/10 of fine flour mixed with oil, which is going to be produced from this sheaf, I suppose, or something else harvested right then, along with wine. Now that represents the people of God, who are brought into play at that point. First, the lamb goes up, then he brings his tribute, which is us. And we discussed that before when we were in Exodus as well, okay? He says, until this day, you shall eat neither bread nor roasted grain. You can't eat any of the new harvest until, first of all, the first fruits of it are sent up to God. Now, that is structuring the book of Revelation. If we look back at Revelation, we find the festival of first fruits in chapters 4 and 5. Jesus is brought before God. And this corresponds with the third day of creation. What happens on the third day of creation? The land and sea are separated, and then what? Out of the land the Lord God caused to grow what? Grain plants and fruit trees. And that's it. You get down to the sixth day, it says, now no plant of the field was yet in the earth when man was made. So there wasn't any broccoli, there wasn't any Brussels sprouts, there wasn't any hedges, there weren't any pine trees, none of that. The only things that are made on the third day are bread and wine plants. Okay? Now you don't believe me? Look it up. I'll prove it to you. Let's just, since some of you are looking curious, Genesis 1, verse 11, let the earth sprout grass, or herbs. Herbs seeding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit after their kind, in which is its seed. On the earth. The earth brought forth grass, herbs, seeding seed after their kind. That is, the kind that just grows seeds out in the open, like grain. And fruit trees bearing fruit with seed inside of them, inside the juicy fruit, after their kind. And that's it. Now, most of the time we kind of assume that that covers for everything, and we might think that if it didn't say in chapter 2, verse 5, no shrub of the field was yet in the earth, and no plant of the field had sprouted. Now, the plant of the field is the grain plant. None of them had sprouted. And no shrub of the field existed. And then God plants a garden, and there are trees, and the trees do have fruit. So now we have three kinds of plants here. Trees already have fruit on them. The grain plants are already made, but they don't yet have grain. They haven't sprouted. And all the other plants haven't been made yet. Now, there are reasons for that. The reason is God's going to wait and see what man does. And when he sins, then the ground brings forth thorns and thistles. The other kinds of plants have thorns and thistles. Fruit trees don't. So there are reasons for that. If you look at the Last Supper, Jesus starts with a glass of wine that is not the sacrament. Then he moves to bread, and then he moves to wine again. If you look at this, you've got your fruit trees. That's what man eats on the first day, unprocessed fruit. It takes a little while to make bread, it takes a longer while to make wine. So the food moves from fruit, bread, wine. Bread is a preliminary eschatology. You can make bread in one day. Wine is a full eschatology because it takes longer to make wine. But before you even make your bread, you've got to have some energy to start with, and that's the unprocessed fruit. Well, that's the eschatology that is there in the vegetables that God sets up in the beginning. And they're here again. Bread and wine. Now, Jesus goes into heaven here in Revelation 4, and He is that first sheaf. And what we'll find is we have a vision in heaven, and God the Father is sitting on the throne. Verse 4 tells us of chapter 4 in Revelation, around the 4 were 24 thrones. On the thrones I saw 24 elders sitting clothed in white garments and golden crowns on their heads. And there was a sea-like crystal in front of it. The 4 living creatures, cherubim, were in front of it. They sing the cherubim hymn, Holy, Holy, Holy. The 24 elders fall down and worship the Lord. And then we see that the one who's sitting on the throne, chapter 5, has a book that's all sealed up. And the strong angel says, who's worthy to open the book and break its seals? And no one was worthy until he's told, stop weeping. The Lion from the tribe of Judah has overcome. He's the power lion. And he can open the book. And so then I saw, wait a minute, not a lion, but a lamb. Now the lamb goes up. A lamb as if slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God. And he came up and took it from the right hand of him who sits on the throne. This is the first human being to ever go past this angelic barrier and take this book. And then the 24 elders and the 4 living creatures praise the Lamb. And myriads and myriads of angels. And every created thing praises Him. Now, since we're overviewing the book, what's going on here? Who are these 24 elders?
Would they be the apostles and the sons of Jacob?
The Old and New Testament church, 12 apostles and the 12 sons of Jacob? No. And the reason why is there's nobody in heaven. No human being has ever gone to heaven. So these 24 elders are angels. They're archangels. Okay. Those aren't the human beings up there. Now, if you look in the temple itself in the Old Testament, when we get to this, we'll look at it in more detail, but we need to get this kind of overview in our mind first. When you look at the temple itself in the days of David, David sets up 24 chief priests to rule the other priests under the high priests. Now, that's on earth. The image of that in heaven is, there's the archangel Michael, Jesus actually. There's 24 angels, chief priests, chief angels, and then there's a vast multitude of angels who are priests in heaven.
Gabriel one of those?
Gabriel's probably one of the 24 chief angels. We're not given it. The Jews speculated all kinds of stuff. They had other angels named Uriel and Ariel and all this, but it's not in the Bible. But that's the same thing, but it's a parallel between heaven and earth. All the people who died in the Old Testament couldn't get into heaven. They went into Abraham's bosom. Limbus patrum is what that's called in theology. They went into a place that was pleasant where they waited. Okay, the place of waiting of the fathers. When Jesus goes to heaven, He takes them with Him. But until that time, heaven is closed. The first person to go to heaven is Jesus. And it says back here, until you offer the first sheaf, you can't eat any of the harvest. Until Jesus goes to heaven, nobody else can eat the harvest. Now the problem is there's this book, and nobody is worthy to open the book. What's this book? The book is the book of kingship, of rule. You rule by the book. And Adam was supposed to mature to the point where God would give him the book and say, okay, Adam, you're a king. But Adam didn't do it. And nobody did it. And nobody in the entire Old Testament was ever worthy to become a king and rule. They stayed priests. They kind of became half kings, but never full kings. And even when God made somebody kind of a half king like David or Solomon or Asa or Hezekiah, they always wound up blowing it by the end. Asa gets sick in the foot and consults with physicians. Hezekiah asks for more life and lets the Babylonians see the treasures. Josiah goes out and gets involved in a stupid war that's none of his affair and gets himself killed. David blows it. Solomon blows it. Nobody's good enough, okay? Not till Jesus. Jesus is a lamb who can become a lion, a priest who can become a king, a servant of the garden who was allowed to move upstream into the land of Eden, and he's given the book so he can rule. So this first sheaf operation here, which is equivalent to the lamb going up, a male lamb without defect, see, wave the sheaf and then send the lamb up. It's the same thing. One image, vegetable image, animal image. Parallel. The lamb goes up, and then he brings with him the church in a symbol. And that's first sheaf. And he's given the book. Now, when did God give the book to Israel? He gave kind of a preliminary book to Israel. We studied this in Exodus. They come out of Egypt. They move and what? The law. And when was the law given? You remember? Pentecost. The next feast is Pentecost. And the next thing in Revelation is the opening of the book. So that the book is opened up and we can start to see what it is. Follow the logic of the book of Revelation. So let's look at Pentecost here in Leviticus 23. This is really the center of the book of Revelation, and I'd like to kind of survey it all today. Maybe we can do this. We're trying to get ankle deep and then knee deep and then waist deep into Revelation before we have to swim and hold our breath underwater and look at the details. Verse 15, Leviticus 23, You shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath, from the day when you brought in the sheaf of the wave offering, in other words, from the Lord's day. There shall be 7 complete Sabbaths, and you shall count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath. So this is a Sunday, a Lord's day, the day after the 7th Sabbath. And you shall present a new grain offering to Yahweh, and this is what it is. You shall bring in from your dwelling places 2 loaves of bread for a wave offering, made of 2 tenths. They shall be of fine flour, baked with leaven, as first fruits to Yahweh. Now, what is this leaven? Yeah, it's yeast, but it's the new yeast, the new leaven of the kingdom. So the new leaven that comes in at Passover has matured to the point where you can make a loaf out of it and offer it to the Lord. Now, notice that this is offered up. There is some type of offering up of a loaf that's grown 7 weeks. We have something has grown. A kingdom has grown to the point where it can be offered to the Lord. Verse 18, Along with the bread you shall offer 7 one-year-old male lambs without defect. The one lamb is moved out to become 7. And a bull of the herd and 2 rams. They are an ascension offering to Yahweh with their grain offering and their libations. A food offering of a soothing aroma, and you shall offer 1 male goat for a sin offering and 2 male lambs 1 year old for a sacrifice of peace offerings. The priest shall wave them with the bread of the first fruits for a wave offering with 2 lambs before Yahweh, and they are holy to Yahweh for the priest. What does that mean? I doubt if you remember this, but what it means is you wave in a peace offering the fat. And the priest puts on his hand, and they take the fat and the fat lobe of the liver and the fat caul and the kidneys and all the other things that are listed in terms of the fat. And they put them on his hands, and they're going to put these 2 loaves on top of him, and he's going to lift them up and wave them to the Lord and then bring them back down. And then offer them on the fire, although the leavened loaves won't be put on the fire. You can never put leaven on the fire. Let's not try to get into all the details concerning that. But they're lifted up to the Lord. Verse 21, On this same day you shall make a proclamation as well. You are to have a holy convocation. You shall do no laborious work. It's a perpetual statute in all your dwelling places throughout your generations. When you reap the harvest of your land, moreover, you shall not reap to the very corners of the field, nor gather the gleaning of your harvest. You're to leave them for the needy and the alien. I am Yahweh your Lord. Now I want to just keep going here. That's the Feast of Pentecost. Then we come to the Feast of Trumpets. Again, Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, 7 weeks, now 7 months. It takes 7 weeks for bread, it takes 7 months for wine. In the 7th month, on the 1st of the month, you shall have a rest, a reminder by blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. You shall not do any laborious work. You shall present a food offering to the Lord. That's all it said about the Feast of Trumpets here. But in the book of Revelation, the trumpet section is the biggest, longest section of the book. So it tremendously expands what's going on here. Now let's look back at Revelation. Pentecost, the book is opened up. And that's the opening up of the seals in chapters 6 and 7. The Lamb reads this out, or he opens it up to make ready for reading it. The book is not opened until all 7 seals are broken. You got to imagine a scroll, see. And the scroll's got 7 wax seals on it. Each of these is broken. And as each one is broken, there's a little picture of what's inside the book. He opens the first seal and he sees Jesus Christ on a white horse conquering. He opens the second seal and another horse comes after him, showing what the conquest involves. 4 horses come out. Then the 5th seal, he sees the souls under the altar. 6th seal, he sees judgment. The 7th seal, well, before the 7th seal is opened, the elect of God from Israel, the first fruits church, the Jewish church set up at Pentecost, is sealed. And then he opens the 7th seal. Chapter 8, he broke the 7th seal and there was silence in heaven for a half an hour. That actually opens the book. But as soon as the book is opened, we see trumpets. So we move to the Feast of Trumpets immediately, but the trumpets close out the Pentecostal period. What starts at Pentecost ends at trumpets. And the 7 trumpets here, which carry us all the way down to the end of chapter 14, describe the Pentecostal church and then the harvest of the Pentecostal church. I just want to show you this, because we'll obviously be coming back to it, but how the book of Revelation works as we're overviewing it. Look at chapter 8. We'll start. He broke the 7th seal. There was silence in heaven for about a half an hour, and I saw 7 angels who stand before God. 7 trumpets were given to them. Another angel came and stood at the altar holding a golden censer, and much incense was given to him that he might add it to the prayers of all the saints upon the golden altar that was before the throne. The smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints went up before God out of the angel's hand. The angel took the censer and filled it with fire of the altar and threw it down to the land. And there followed peals of thunder and sounds and flashes of lightning and an earthquake. Now, what do you think that's describing there? This angel casting fire on the earth. This is not one of the 7 trumpet angels. Then they start to sound and things start to happen. Judgments start to happen. But what is this? This angel casting fire from the altar onto the earth. The altar that's right before the throne of God. Let me remind you of what is before the throne. There were 7 lamps of fire burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. The altar, which is before the throne, fire is taken off and thrown to the earth. What does that refer to? And then there are phenomena. Guess. It's a historical event. Well, yeah, I think that the phenomena point to the giving of the law, but what was that? When did fire come down from heaven? After Jesus went to heaven. When did fire come down? Jesus goes up to heaven, first sheaf, Pentecost. This is Pentecost. I'm 94.6% sure. Okay. This is Pentecost. Don't think that the book of Revelation is nothing but a series of pictures of God punishing the wicked. It's not always that. And here, the point is, the Lamb goes to heaven, he opens the book, and what's the first thing he does? He sends the Spirit. And the Spirit comes down as tongues of fire. The 7 spirits before the throne. The altar of incense before the throne. in answer to the prayers of the saints who have prayed all these centuries throughout the Old Covenant for this to come. The Spirit comes, and there are peals of thunder and sounds and flashes of lightning and an earthquake. Well, all these things are going to be brought about by the church. The church is going to do these things. And if you read Acts, you'll find they were all together praying, and suddenly there was a great wind and the house shook. They were all together praying, and there was a big earthquake, and Peter got let out of prison. Okay, this is all the work of the Spirit. Now, what does the Spirit do when He comes down at Pentecost? He's equivalent of leaven being inserted into a loaf. And He starts to create the church. And the church grows and grows and grows until it's harvested. Now, the harvest happens in chapter 14. So if we look over in chapter 14, we find the harvest of the Pentecostal church, which the day of trumpets points to. Okay, what has grown between Pentecost and trumpets is now harvested. And this harvest is wheat and wine, wheat and grapes. Chapter 14 of Revelation. Actually, we can look a little bit earlier. Chapter 14, verse 1. I looked, and behold, the Lamb was standing on Mount Zion, and with Him 144,000. These are the Jewish believers who were sealed and who were baptized at Pentecost, along with any Gentiles that came into the church. This is the first fruits church. The first fruits church. They are on Mount Zion, which is on the earth. And they're singing. And they're faithful. They don't worship the beast. The beast has been identified in chapter 13, and they don't worship him. Then in verse 13 of chapter 14 it says, I heard a voice from heaven saying, Right, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors. And I looked, and now we find the harvest of that first fruits church. The martyrdom of a large number of the earliest Christians. I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and sitting on the cloud was one like a son of man, having a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. And another angel came out of the temple, crying out with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, Put in your sickle and reap, because the hour to reap is come, because the harvest of the earth is ripe. Jesus says the Father decides the day and the hour, and so the Father on His throne sends an angel out to tell Jesus it's time to reap. So He who sat on the cloud swung His sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. That's not a picture of the judgment of the wicked. That's the harvest of the church, the wheat harvest. Then we have a second picture. Another angel came out of the temple that's in heaven, and he also had a sharp sickle. And another angel, the one who has power over fire. Who's this? This is the one who sent the fire down back in chapter 8 and started all this. The one who started the Pentecostal church by sending fire down. Now he calls for the full harvest of the Pentecostal church. The one who has power over fire comes out from the altar, and he called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, Put in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, because her grapes are ripe. And the angel swung his sickle to the earth and gathered the clusters from the vine of the earth and threw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God. Now, the winepress is not God's wrath. The wine contains God's wrath. So, we will get to this more later. The martyrdom of the saints produces wrath wine that is then poured out on Babylon and that Babylon drinks. And the winepress was trodden outside the city. Hebrews says, let us go outside the camp with Him. Jesus said, you will be driven out of the synagogue. We see in Acts that the saints were driven out of the city. This is a harvest of the saints. The winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood came from the winepress up to the horses' bridles for a distance of 200 miles. The blood of the martyrs covers the land, and what does blood spilled on the land do? It cries out for the avenger of blood. And boy, that's what happens next. Okay? The avenger of blood comes and pours out these 7 bowls on Babylon, and that's it. So this is the harvest of that church, and now in chapter 15 we find, verse 2, I saw as it were a sea of glass mixed with fire, and those who come off victorious from the beast. So you see, the 144,000 who were on the earth in chapter 14, now they're in heaven in chapter 15, and what's happened then. But the interesting things about church history is that when you look at the immediate post-apostolic church, you find they didn't know very much. You read the apostolic fathers like Barnabas, Clement, and other people who are writing around the year 100, and you think, how could they not know more than they know? And you start looking at the other fathers, and you find that they don't know much either. Barnabas says he's got this exposition of the dietary laws that's crazy. He says the Jews were never supposed to actually offer sacrifices. Now, he didn't get that from Paul. And you think, what happened to the disciples of the disciples? Didn't John and James and Peter and Mark and Matthew and Paul raise up a large company of people who would know New Testament theology, biblical theology, and pass it on? There's a gap. And the explanation for that gap seems to be that the two witnesses are killed in the city, and the first fruits church is harvested, and the church kind of starts over again after AD 70. Some escape. We go back to Leviticus 23 and we find, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very corners, nor gather the gleaning of the harvest. You're to leave them for the needy and the alien. Now, I would suggest that, of course, not everybody was harvested, but there is a big harvest. A lot of Christians are taken off the scene, and that's why there is not the kind of continuity we expect between the apostolic church and the early church. Why they seem to be ignorant of so many things that are in Paul.
I'm not sure exactly, because it's been a while since I read the book, but I think Chilton's Days of Vengeance suggests that no Christians died in AD 70. They were dispersed. I'm not sure that's where I got that or not.
Yeah, I don't think Christians died under the Romans. They were persecuted and killed by the Jewish church and the Judaizers before the destruction of Jerusalem. See, Babylon is punished for killing the saints. The wine that's poured out of the winepress is then taken and poured on Babylon. So that's what seems to be happening there. So the trumpets end this Pentecostal church. Very quickly, in Leviticus 23, the sixth feast or event is the Day of Atonement, which happens in the seventh month. Verse 26, Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, on exactly the 10th day of the seventh month is the Day of Atonement. It shall be a holy convocation for you. You shall humble your souls, present a food offering by fire. You shall not do any work. It's a day of atonement to make atonement on your behalf before Yahweh your God. If there's any person who will not humble himself on this day, he shall be cut off from his people. As for any person who does any work on the same day, that person I will destroy. You shall do no work at all. It's to be a perpetual statute throughout your generations and all your dwelling places. It's a Sabbath of complete rest to you, and you shall humble your soul on the 9th of the month at evening. From evening to evening you shall keep this Sabbath. That atonement section corresponds to the destruction of Babylon and the bowls in the book of Revelation, chapters 16 through 20. And an interesting thing that happens on the Day of Atonement, and this is inverted in Revelation, is the sins are put on the one lamb and also on the scapegoat, and the scapegoat is sent out, and the lamb is killed. Now, that has all happened at Calvary. But now what happens in Revelation is those who refuse to humble themselves are destroyed. And in a sense, Jesus, the scapegoat, is sent out, but what we see him doing is riding out in conquest in chapter 19. And what follows is the millennium. So being sent outside the gates, being driven out of the city, has the opposite effect of what the Jews expected it would have. They say, well, we're putting you out of the synagogue. We're kicking you out of Jerusalem. The saints are scattered abroad in Acts chapter 8. Jesus is driven outside the city. But what happens is, as he's driven out, he rides on his white horse and conquers all the other nations. So the millennium comes, and the millennium lasts. Finally, in Leviticus 23, we have a picture of the Feast of Tabernacles, which is the end of everything. I won't read it because we're out of time, but it corresponds to the New Jerusalem section of Revelation, chapter 21 and 22. The tabernacles are little homes that you build as you gather around God. They're the first garden-like form of it. You just take leafy boughs and trees and willows and you make a little garden. But the garden is primordial. The city is eschatological. And so this kind of big garden that's made around God's house with all of these little leaf and branch tents becomes the New Jerusalem. And so the equivalent of the Feast of Tabernacles, the last feast, is Jerusalem. And the language is all the same. Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell in their midst, and all this. The language calls it up. We'll see more of this as we go through. What I wanted you to begin to get more of a feel of is this agricultural cycle and the series of feasts, and then how they're applied in Revelation. We'll be coming back to this